Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode here. We're going to be reviewing Unit 7 today in AP World History in 516. When we look at Unit 7, it's really all about the long-term and immediate causes of World War I and World War II, but we're also going to take a look at things like the Great Depression during this period of time. Now, today what we're going to look at is the following prompt. Evaluate the impact of World War I and World War II. We're going to look at it similarly to the other previous unit reviews by looking at SPICE, social, political, interactions with the environment, cultural, and economic. All right, so let's begin. So when we talk about social, let's first start off by looking at some of the social causes of World War I. For starters, these aspects can really be looked at not only from a social aspect, but a political one, economic, cultural. So it's not like these are just one size fits all, like it must go into social, but I felt like this was one of the better categories to place it in. So when we look at social causes of World War I, we have to look at both the immediate and then the long-term causes of the war. So the immediate cause is we have a guy by the name of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He's the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and he's killed by a Serbian nationalist by the name of Gavrilo Princip. He also happens to be a member of a group called the Black Hand. The Black Hand is a Serbian nationalist group that is fighting for and promoting Serbian nationality, or the creation of a Serbian state. All right, so once we have this assassination, this is where we're going to see at least one of the long-term causes of World War I come to play, known as alliances. But let's take a look at some of the long-term causes. So to begin with, we have militarism. Militarism is where a country is attempting to establish themselves as a dominant military power. And the way that they're doing this is by spending a lot of money on the military. What we find is that whenever we look at documents of the military expenditures from, say, 1880 leading up to World War I, all of these European countries that are practicing imperialism are spending more and more and more on their militaries, not only so that they can gain more territory, but we also see that these European nations are fighting one another in these other areas of the world. We'll talk about that later on, but we're starting to see this heavy promotion of militarism where militaries are expanding, therefore the technologies are improving, and therefore making war way more deadly. Now, the second part of this is alliances, all right? So leading up to World War I, there were known alliances, so alliances that were out there for everyone to know about. But then we also had secret alliances that people didn't know about. And what starts to happen is that as European countries start declaring war on other countries, that's going to bring in all of these other countries that didn't really need to get involved, but they were obligated to because of either the known alliances or the secret alliances. And this is where we see this become a global war, not because it was a global issue, but rather all of these alliances brought everybody into the war and forced them to fight. Now, the next one is imperialism. So we've spent a lot of time talking about imperialism. You know, England is imperializing parts of North America, India. You know, you have Belgium that's in Southern Africa, as well as in other areas in the Pacific. You have the Spanish that have pretty large controls over Latin and South America. And this is where we see this drive for all of those colonies is imperialism, this desire that countries need to expand in order to gain new resources, and because of the resources, that is propelling them not only in their nationalist ideologies, but also their militarism as well, because you do need to have money to fund your military, and the one way that you get a lot of money is to have a lot of high-quality colonies. What we start to see is that it's not only about having the best resources in your colony, but it's about having the most resources and the most colonies. And oftentimes what we see is that European nations are often at war with one another to gain more territory. So for example, the French and Indian War is between the French and the British. The British end up gaining huge territories, not only in North America, but in other parts of the world. We also have the Boer Wars in South Africa. Again, here the English are fighting the Dutch. The English win, therefore gaining a lot of this new territory that just so happens to have a lot of expensive resources like diamonds. We also see that eventually, once the United States becomes a nation, they get in on the imperialist action too with the Spanish-American War, where they gain things like Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. So again, a lot of this is like a desire for these natural resources, but we're going to see a lot of conflict and tension take place. We even see this because in Africa, European nations are trying to figure out the best way to divide it. This is where we start to see the Berlin Conference in the 1880s serve as an attempt at peacefully dividing Africa amongst European nations. But as we can tell, this is just going to further reinforce the competitions between European nations. And with competitions, it inherently divides these European countries rather than bringing them together. And that kind of feeds into this next part, nationalism. Nationalism has been defined as this intense pride for your country that's divided across one's nationality. And certain countries began to develop a sense of hyper-nationalism or ultra-nationalism. And this is some of the stuff that we see in Germany and Italy that led to the rise of people like Hitler and Mussolini in these totalitarian dictatorships. So those are the main causes. These last four were the long-term causes, with the main or immediate cause being the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. Now, when we look at conflicts in World War I, again, I'm going to look at this from a social perspective, but it can have aspects or elements in other areas as well. We start to see a new development in war called total war. It's a new strategy that begins in World War I. That brings civilians to the forefront of war. So in the past, what we've seen is that war has been reserved for just soldiers on the battlefield. And oftentimes, you know, if you think about, say, events in like the American Revolution, the British and then the colonists would set a particular time, a particular date, and during a particular time of year to meet and have these battles, because oftentimes it was hard to fight in the wintertime, and they needed to have good weather. Those were the kind of the rules of conduct, if you will, whenever it comes to war. But we start to see in World War I that those codes start to break down. So, for example, we start to see poison gas, machine guns, submarines, and in particular, we start to see Germany practice something called unrestricted submarine warfare, which led to the sinking of one of the famous ships called the Lusitania, which had many civilians on there. We start to see that even propaganda becomes and takes a shaping role in how people are thinking about war, how they're contributing to the war effort overall. We also see other technologies like airplanes and tanks, and realistically, all of these new styles of warfare simply make war more deadly. And if you start to look at some of the statistics about the number of deaths over time, you start to see that World War I is that big event where there is a mass increase of deaths due to war. And before it's eclipsed by World War II, it is the largest or the most fatal war that humans have had up to this point in history. Now, kind of jumping ahead, we have to look at also German aggression. This is looking more towards the start of World War II, where Germans are using certain social ideologies like scientific racism, which is very similar to a form of social Darwinism. If you remember from last unit, we talked about social Darwinism being this concept that some races of humans are inherently more superior than others. Very similar to scientific racism. And this is where we start to see German ideology develop the Nuremberg laws. These Nuremberg laws were an attempt to prevent the marriage of certain groups with other groups. And realistically, the idea or the intent of this law was to make sure that Jewish people married Jewish people, and that German people who fit what's called the Aryan race married other people within that race. That way it quote unquote kept the race pure. All right, obviously this is going to start to lead into things like the Holocaust, and really it's not necessarily a new idea, this idea of some races being more superior than others. all European nations have been practicing something to this degree for quite some time. Germany just so happens to be kind of that founding example that it's most noted in history, but they're definitely not the only guilty party here whenever it comes to social Darwinism or scientific racism. One of the events that we see start this process of genocide will be Kristallnacht. It's an event where Jews in Germany were killed, about 90 of them, and that led to about 300,000 to begin with to be rounded up, gathered, and then placed in concentration camps across Germany. Now, again, I think it's really important here to note that, yes, the Holocaust was primarily targeted against Jewish people. However, those were not the only people that were targeted. People who were considered undesirables were also targeted. And, for example, an undesirable in Germany oftentimes would have been people who were mentally impaired, people who were homosexual, people who had opposing ideas or ideologies were oftentimes deemed undesirables or social undesirables. So yeah, the Holocaust is a lot about the Jewish people, but it's certainly not the only group that was specifically targeted in Germany. It was much more expansive than that, which sometimes, unless you're actually going to like the National History Museum or the Holocaust Museum, like in Washington, D.C., I think they may even have one in Atlanta, or they did at one point. Unless you go to one of those areas, that you're probably not going to hear that history, that it's not just Jewish people that are targeted. It's a larger group of people. In any case, though, let's move on to some political aspects that are happening as a result of or because of the world wars. So kind of like giving some context into what's happening in Russia at this time. There's a long-term social unrest occurring in Russia that turned pretty violent on an event known as Bloody Sunday in 1905. This saw thousands of workers who were protesting peacefully, and they were looking for better working conditions, wages, and they were working for towards something called universal suffrage. So having the right to vote, with no other kind of catches of, oh, you have to be able to do this, or you have to be this gender or this race to be able to vote. During this protest, about 1,300 workers were killed. And this ultimately is going to lead to the much larger and then more successful Russian Revolution in 1917, where we see a group of people known as the Bolsheviks who are pro-communist. Oftentimes they're referred to as the Reds. And they are facing against the whites, and the whites represent pro-monarchy. So the Bolsheviks end up gaining control, and under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin, institute the economic ideals of communism into the USSR. Now, Vladimir Lenin ends up having his NEP, I believe, the New Economic Policy, but ultimately that's unsuccessful because Vladimir Lenin dies kind of early on into his leadership, and then Joseph Stalin comes in and attempts to do something very similar, but ultimately maybe or maybe not that successful. So that is Russia. And if you take a look at this timeline right here, 1917, this is in the midst of World War I. And this is where we see Russia exit World War I and kind of the United States come into World War I. And this is going to have some pretty long-standing impacts in terms of bolstering the United States and propelling them to kind of the forefront of conversation about being a world power. Now, whenever it comes to the U.S. in World War I, prior to their involvement in World War I, they are officially neutral, and they're practicing a policy known as isolationism. Isolationism is something that was practiced in the past by Japan and China. Ultimately, it was kind of their demise because they were isolated for so long and fell so far behind. But for the U.S., it's not like they were like completely isolated. They just didn't really want to get involved in the affairs of other countries that were in Europe. Certainly, they were interested in what was happening in the Western Hemisphere, but everything was going fairly well for the U.S. in that area of the world, but they didn't really care what was happening in Europe at the time. One of the events that kind of gets the attention of the U.S., though, is the sinking of the Lusitania. So not only was that irritating for the U.S. because they've lost about 108 or so civilians that were Americans, but it also kind of brought to the forefront the power that Germany had, not only with their new technology and U-boats, but also, again, this aspect of total warfare that is now kind of permeating World War I. The event that brings the U.S. ultimately into the war is the Zimmermann telegram that prompted the U.S. to enter, where Germany sends this telegram to intended for Mexico, asking Mexico to basically attack the United States, keep them preoccupied, and if the Central Powers won, Mexico would be given a lot of the territory that it lost in the Spanish-American War. So states like California, New Mexico, Colorado, parts of Texas perhaps, that general area. It's a large amount of land that they could have gained, but it was intercepted by the United States, and ultimately it was another factor that brought the U.S. into the war. Now, looking at the end of the war, one of the most important political things that's happening is the Treaty of Versailles. And what this established was that Germany was going to take full responsibility for the war. The only thing is that they only made up one out of the 3 countries that were part of the Central Powers. So in the get-go, like, Germany is going to get destroyed whenever it comes to this treaty. People are just gunning for Germany. And this is one of the arguments that could be made that says, yeah, I mean, Germany was in the wrong in World War II for sure, but some of those like underlying motivations for where we see or why we see people like Hitler rise to power in Germany might be connected back to this Treaty of Versailles and how poorly Germany was actually treated in all of this. But beyond that, they could only have about 100,000 person standing army. They couldn't have a navy or an air force, and they lost all of their colonies. So as a result of all of this, as the world goes into the Great Depression, we see that Germany ends up succumbing to even worse side effects of the Great Depression in comparison to other areas of the world. Again, kind of feeling those long-term sentiments of anger and resentment toward the Allied powers like the United States, France, and Great Britain. Within this, too, we also have to look at the United States' role with Woodrow Wilson, who presents the 14 points. And one of the major points of the 14 points is the League of Nations. So this organization was created and was an attempt to serve as like this first line of defense to prevent nations from going to war. Instead of just going out to war, they could use the League of Nations as a way to discuss their issues and come to some sort of peaceful conclusion. The U.S., though, did not join this, one, because they're practicing isolationism once the war ends, but two, there was a major concern that other countries would have a say in what the U.S. was or could do if the U.S. entered into the League of Nations. So there's a lot of concern here about who had power and say of what the U.S. could or couldn't do. And that was something that the United States was simply not willing to allow at this time. Now, as we go forward and we look at some more of these unresolved tensions, yes, the Treaty of Versailles is a major issue, but we also have the shift of power of these colonies. So not only is Germany losing all of its territory, but Austria-Hungary loses its territory, and the Ottoman Empire, who we oftentimes maybe kind of forget is also a part of this, basically disintegrates, and a lot of those territories now come under the control of the Allied powers. So you have the mandate system here that stated that all territories previously under central power would come under Allied power. Now, in particular, the mandate system is more so for like the Middle East area, and for the most part, England and France will gain those territories. The United States, I don't really know how much they actually gained out of all of this. I'm not sure that they were as interested in some of those colonies, but perhaps they got a few of them. Another major decision that we see here is that because of the mandate system, we start to see calls for Middle Eastern independence, known as Pan-Arabism. We'll see that places like like in India or in the Indian National Conference are calling for very similar types of independence. Pan-Africanism also is in this time as well. But then the last thing that we need to talk about politically here is the Balfour Declaration. This ended up establishing the nation of Palestine as a new home for Jews of Europe. Now, Palestine was a country prior to World War I. However, it had not been accepting of Jewish people because Palestinians are Muslim typically. This Balfour decision is where we start to see kind of the seeds of the formation of Israel, and then ultimately we will have a lot of issues between Israeli, Palestinian, and conflicts that are still going on even to this day. Now, as we look at interactions with the environment, I'll have to say that there are probably way more interactions with the environment than what I'm going to list here. But for the most part, I'm just going to stick to the use of nuclear weapons and the environmental damage, not only that's going to take place to the physical landscape, as well as to obviously like the animal life that's there, but we also start to see that people who are exposed to the nuclear weapons not only end up having a higher chance of having cancer, but those genetic mutations that were caused by the radiation have been passed down to their subsequent heirs or their offspring. Again, kind of emphasizing that it's not just a landscape change, but it's a biological change that's happening here as well. Now, culturally, some things that are happening throughout this time. First off, we need to look at this idea of ethnic collectivization. So in the Ottoman Empire, so kind of going back to before World War I, we start to see the Ottoman Empire is having a lot of trouble unifying its groups of people, because you've got Jewish people who came from, you know, the Janissaries, who were Ashkani Jews who were kicked out of Europe early on, who came to the Ottoman Empire looking for acceptance. You've got Muslims, you've got all of these different ethnicities, and it's very difficult to unify them. So we have a group who is promoting this idea of Turkification, which encouraged this use of identity and assimilation into one Turkish culture. Ultimately, this is not going to work, as there are simply way too many ethnicities, way too many religious tensions that are in this area for this to actually work. Now, when we look at this too, obviously, throughout this time, yeah, there is going to be mass genocide, and oftentimes the Holocaust kind of dominates the conversation, and as it should. You know, it's one of the largest genocides that happen. It's one of the most well-known, most well-researched, etc. But it's not the only genocide that's taking place. What we start to see is we have an Armenian genocide between 1915 to 1917 that saw Armenians who are targeted in Turkey. Obviously, we have the Holocaust that's gathering Jewish people and undesirables who are systematically rounded up and forced into concentration and death camps where, you know, about 6 million Jews were killed. However, I think experts kind of have a larger number than that in terms of just total number of people that were killed. I would say a lot of them would err more so on the side of like 8 to 12 million or so. But next we have to look at Bosnia. All right, there's there's a genocide that takes place in Bosnia around the 1980s, so well after World War II, but this is certainly an impact of World War II because, again, the countries were created and the ethnicities and the religious groups that were there were kind of overlooked, and they just said, all right, everybody's just going in this country, and that leads to a lot of issues. So we have Muslims who were living in Bosnia-Herzegovina who were killed or driven out as the nation attempted to define their identity based on religious lines, and in particular we see Christian groups persecuting Muslim groups in this area of the world. And then, of course, we must also talk about the rape of Nanjing. So prior to World War II, Japan is practicing imperialism, and around 1936, they invade mainland China. And about during a 6-week period, about 400,000 people are killed, and many thousands of women are raped and killed. And estimates, I think maybe a little bit lower. But the crazy thing about this is that I don't think most people know about this, or back then even knew about it was happening. Eventually it became known that yes, this happened, but other people were way more caught up with what Germany was doing at this time and just kind of neglected the fact that Japan was doing very similar things, just in a different part of the world. And that brings us now to the economic aspects that are happening here. So with the economy, first off, let's look at some reform. So in particular, when we look at the Mexican Revolution in 1910, we have several people who are listed here: Francisco Villa, Emiliano Zapata, who are attempting to create and instill almost very similar to communist ideas, where they're looking to redistribute the wealth. And in this case, they're looking to redistribute land and who owns land, because in this area of the world, a very small percentage of people own the land. Everybody else is simply renting it. Now, when you look at other parts of the world, and especially in the United States, before the Great Depression, you have a period of time known as the Roaring Twenties. And for a lot of Americans, life was really good in the Roaring Twenties. Businesses were producing a lot of goods. People were now buying those goods because they were now cheaper. So things like cars and radios become a lot more accessible to many Americans. Now, while all this is going on, it's not like life in the United States is just everybody's doing great. If you look at African Americans and other minorities, they're still facing the same economic hardships under the sharecropping system. They are still dealing with the political and social institutions like the Jim Crow laws as well as the KKK. So while generally the Roaring Twenties are described as a positive time, it's not a positive time for every single person in the United States. Now, as we go to the Great Depression, obviously unemployment skyrockets. In the United States, about 25% of the population is out of work at the height, but in places like Germany, it's almost double that, maybe even more than double it. And what we see is that there's a lot of factors driving this. We have, one, this idea of underconsumption, so people are not buying as many goods. Because if you think about it, yeah, if a car is cheaper, sure, you can afford to buy it, but it's not like people are replacing their cars on a yearly basis or very frequently at all. So at some point, businesses start just making too many things, and that's where we get to this idea coupled together of overproduction. So as businesses are making way too many goods, people are buying less and less, which means that they're just sitting there losing money by making things. And then we also see, too, that people get so caught up in the stock market that they end up buying stocks on credit. So they use a loan to buy a stock. And obviously, that's going to have huge implications. If the stock goes down, then how do you pay for that loan? And this hits people incredibly hard. So we see people like FDR. He is elected president of the United States, and he implements what's referred to as the New Deal. The New Deal is a form of Keynesian economics that encouraged government spending, encouraged even like deficit spending as well. And under the New Deal, he had 3 goals. One, he wanted to help Americans, and by helping Americans, he was going to give them jobs. A lot of times these were government jobs, building things like roads, bridges, and dams. Even schools and parks were part of this too. The second thing is that he needed to recover the financial institutions, because banks in the United States were pretty rare after the stock market crash. About 26 states did not have a single bank because they had all gone out of business. And then lastly, he wanted to make sure that he put things in place that would prevent this kind of depression from happening again. So we'll see limitations in the stock market today. If the stock market falls too fast and too much, they put a pause on it so that it doesn't just completely fall. We saw with the GameStop stuff, not pretty recently, that people put limits on how much people could buy of this stock. Some of them were not even able to buy it at all because the run-up had gone so high and people didn't want them to lose their money. Right? There are issues, and obviously people from different perspectives have different ideas, but it's intended to prevent you from losing all of your money. And then overall, whenever we conclude this, looking at the overall impact of World War II, and this will get us into kind of introducing Unit 8, is after World War II, we see that two nations become the dominant powers. Obviously, the US and the USSR become these superpowers. And then we start to see the Cold War begins to be the determining factor of who is going to be a superpower. All right, so as we go into next unit, we will take a look at the major events of the Cold War and what happened during that period of history. All right, but that is it for the Unit 7 review. This is, of course, by no means just complete or anything, but this goes over the major aspects of World War I, World War II. All right. I'm going to head off for now. I appreciate everybody who's been watching and who's been supporting this channel. If you're not already subscribed, please make sure that you are, or you make sure you hit that subscribe button. And if you haven't liked the video, just put a like down there. That way other people can start to see it and gain more information about what's going on in history. Thanks.